All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us virtually for this author's talk. My name is Ray. I'm the superintendent of St. Gaudens National Historical Park, and I'm sorry that you aren't able to all join us at the park for this talk, but by being in this virtual space together, we've really enabled people from all over the country to join us for this event. And looking at the folks that have registered for this event, we really do have people from much further afield than just New England enjoying this presentation. St. Gaudens National Historical Park preserves the home, studios, gardens, and artwork of the American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, and also tells the story of the artists of the Cornish colony that formed around St. Gaudens here in New Hampshire. The park is joined in this mission by our longstanding partner, the St. Gaudens Memorial, a nonprofit organization whose work ensures that the park remains a living memorial to St. Gaudens and supports artistic, musical, educational, and collections conservation initiatives at the park. This author's talk is being jointly sponsored by both the National Park Service and the St. Gaudens Memorial. And I'm happy to be joined in the moderating of the questions that will follow by Memorial President Thayer Tolles. A few notes about our format here tonight before I introduce our speaker. First, the chat is muted during the presentation, so if you have a question, please share it in the Q&A section. The Q&A section will be monitored throughout the presentation, and questions will either be answered by Thayer in real time or saved for a live answer after the presentation. The presentation is also being broadcast on Facebook Live, and I'll be moderating that chat. Also, captions are being provided if anyone needs them, and they can be turned on in your preferences. We'll strive to ensure that this entire session lasts about an hour, though if the question period is lively, we may run a few minutes long. And now it's time to get on to the main event, and it is my honor here tonight and pleasure to introduce our speaker, Valerie Balint. Valerie is the Senior Program Manager for the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, which is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is administered at Chesterwood, the former home and studio of sculptor Daniel Chester French. She is also the author of the newly released Guide to Historic Artist Homes and Studios. Prior to heading the Historic Artist Homes and Studios program, Valerie served for 17 years on the curatorial staff at Frederick Church's Olana, which is also a Historic Artist Homes and Studios program site. She was most recently at Olana as the interim director of collections and research. In that capacity, she was the co-organizer and co-curator of Olana's annual exhibitions and the accompanying publications for those exhibitions. She's a frequent lecturer and writer on preserved artist spaces, on Frederick Church, the Hudson River School, and American art and social history of the mid-19th and early 20th century. One of the great treats in life is having the opportunity to listen to someone speak on a subject that they are truly passionate about. And as a result, we are in for a great treat tonight. And with that, I pass the baton on to Valerie.
Thank you so much, Rick. I'm actually going to do my introductory remarks with my PowerPoint on. Whoopsie daisy, just give me a second. There we go. Great. Good evening, and thank you, Rick, for that lovely introduction. I wanted to express my thanks to Thayer Tolles for extending this invitation, and to staff at both the St. Gaudens National Historical Park and the St. Gaudens Memorial for all the support as we plan this event. for hosting me and for their technical assistance tonight. It takes a village to do a virtual lecture, and I'm very grateful. As Rick noted, I'm Valerie Balint, and I manage the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which we affectionately refer to by our acronym HOS, and of which the St. Gaudens site is a vital member. And here I just pay a bit of homage to our Uber host this evening, the master himself, Augustus, and a nod to his sublime work, Diana. I'm delighted to be here to talk about the program and the new guidebook we've launched. The Trust created HOS in 1999 to support those places dedicated to national artistic legacy. What began as a network of about a dozen sites has grown to a membership consortium of 44 sites across 21 states, representing over 300 artists and spanning 3 centuries. Its administrative home, as Rick has pointed out, is at Chesterwood, home of the sculpture of the Lincoln Memorial, which is on the book's cover, which you see at left. Collectively, these sites are all preserved and now open as independent public museums and provide opportunity for more than 1 million visitors annually to engage in place-based and immersive experience. This guidebook represents the first time these sites have been brought together, with over 250 images, sort of an Art Survey 101 class. 2019 marked the 20th anniversary of this program, and this book is a celebratory benchmark of how we've grown over these years. The book was generously funded with lead support from the Henry Luce Foundation, as well as additional support from the Wyatt Foundation for American Art. Both have been longtime supporters of HOS. It's a unique publication. We deliberately set out to create a guidebook, which we hoped would get people out to explore. It's meant to be put in your car, your purse, your backpack, but we also wanted to have it serve as armchair travel, to sweep you away through its images and narratives. What we could not anticipate when we started was COVID-19 realities, but I now hope that this book will first become dog-eared by people marking all the places they want to go, and then well-worn when people can embark on real travel again. Something that I love about the program and the book is that we seek to represent the depth and breadth of the places where art was made in this country, from the Gilded Age statuary and artistic enclave St. Gaudens created in Cornish, New Hampshire, to the converted urban commercial space in Chicago, designed by 20th century imagist Roger Brown, who you see pictured here in the sample entry of the book, and everywhere in between. And this evening, I hope to take you on your first short excursion. But first, I want to take a slight detour. Here is the Lincoln Memorial. Its impact transcends art. It is synonymous with national ideas of democracy, personal freedom, and social justice, right to assemble in protest and celebration. And it has become a place of pilgrimage for millions, and is perhaps our nation's most famous piece of art in the world. No offense meant to St. Gaudens and present company. But it is easy to forget that objects like this were made by a person and in a place, created through physical work and engagement with mental creativity and genius, by artists who were contemporary and groundbreaking in their own era, who lived in places that both inspired them and were transformed by them, in places where they played out their life narratives, where they enjoyed triumphs, but also suffered loss, where they were as much people as they were artists, and I mean artists with that capital A. If art in museums and gallery spaces or a public monument is the output that we all experience, these preserved sites represent all the input that went into making that piece. And as preserved places that were once the locus of creativity, they are now uniquely poised to inspire visitors today. My own journey, or artistic genesis, began here at Chesterwood in Stockbridge, Mass. As Rick has said, the summer home and studio of sculptor Daniel Chester French. I visited here on a special arts program trip with my family at the age of 10. Yes, I learned about the Lincoln, but I also discovered how he built this ingenious rail track just beyond the doors of the studio to take works in progress out into the open air to view how changes in light and perspective would affect the piece. I roamed around the artist-designed gardens and woodland walks, took in the majesty of the view of Monument Mountain, which inspired French to buy this piece of property. I heard about the family life he nurtured here as a respite from the rest of the year he spent in New York City in his studio, and how he called this place heaven. More than a decade later, when I went to apply for my very first internship and saw an ad for Chesterwood, all the sensory power of this place and that visit flooded back. I still feel that today when I am there. It's sort of what I like to call a genius loci, the guiding spirit of maybe those who originally lived there, but also those of us who are responsible for that legacy today. That is what every site in the network and in this book has to offer, and I hope that we have managed to evoke that. These are also the places of everyday life, including personal decorative choices we can all relate to, although perhaps achieved with more talented eyes than many of us can personally aspire to. Each of these places is singular, but there are commonalities as well and connective threads. They demonstrate how creativity is not linear. I urge you to just take a moment to look at the wallpaper chosen by French for his home. Could it be the artist was inspired by the tapestries he viewed hanging in St. Gaudens's own house prior to purchasing his own country retreat, but adapted the idea to his own sensibilities? Was he similarly inspired to try landscape design as St. Gaudens did here as a new creative outlet, and one so well suited to sculptors who can imagine spaces in the round and from every angle? When we encounter these aesthetic explorations, they should be considered as extensions of artistic practice, which can give us further insight into their work if we are looking thoughtfully enough. I like to think that what is offered at these sites is not so much an example of art imitating life as an integration of art and life. The book includes artists and places you may be familiar with and those awaiting your discovery. On the top line, Andrew Wyatt, a center figure in 3 generations of artists. His local boyhood home of Chadsford, Pennsylvania, and nearby Crooner Farm fueled him his entire career. He made works in a converted schoolhouse turned studio. To be there is to better understand the work and the complexities of this deeply introspective human being. By contrast, on the lower level is Grace Hudson, who you may not be familiar with, a formally educated portrait artist who depicted the indigenous Pomo people, who along with her husband designed an arts and crafts home in Northern California's Mendocino Valley. Let's look inside a bit more. This is the sign on Andrew Wyatt's studio door. It lets you immediately know the nature of this person. But it's a good reminder that we are ultimately in private spaces. We are entering the inner sanctum. It's interesting to see what various artists needed to inspire them, or what environments they needed to surround themselves with in order to be productive. I think this is something we are all thinking about right now. How to work from home, how to balance life and work, how they are interconnected. Certainly artists understood this. They don't stop being artists when they close the studio door. So let's take a little journey together. I can't possibly get to all 44 sites, but I do hope I will entice you to discover more. I'm going to first take us to several other sites in New England, and then explore some of the homes of other sculptors in the network across the country. Each of these sites and artists warrant entire seminars of their own. So I'll just scratch the surface, but I also want to use these sites to flesh out some larger concepts about artists' spaces. Here's a couple you may not know: George L.K. Morris and Susie Frelingheisen. This provides a beautiful modernist counterpoint to the retreats created by St. Gaudens in French. And this site is just down the road from Chesterwood in nearby Lenox, Massachusetts. An artist couple who were deeply involved in the American abstract artist movement. They created a rural retreat designed in concert with a local architect. Stucco, glass brick, and a fresco designed by Morris in the garage breezeway. One of the first modern structures in the state, built within the same period as Marcel Breuer's Gropius house. The studio at far left and up on the hill and attached to the house is earlier still and predates the house. Based on Aux Enfants studio in Paris by Le Corbusier, which Morris saw when he was studying with the Cubist painter Léger. This is a very interesting couple. He was an art critic and editor, and she was an opera singer. This is so indicative of the complex lives of these artists in the network, and we seek to make these biographical details come alive in this book. Here is the living room, replete with an Argentinian leather floor, Art Deco furnishings, and Susie's stunning piano. Beyond the large windows, a lush landscape, orchards, pool house, and pond await. This was a glamorous couple, and the house reflects that. But I want to draw your attention to the murals and bas-relief by Morris. Morris was a sculptor as well as a painter. There are frescoes, reliefs, and murals made by George and Susie throughout the house. These are works of art that can only be seen here in the places for which they were designed. Many sites in the network include these exclusive elements. For each site in the book, I sought to include a little bit of a fun fact. In this instance, when design costs of the house ran over, something some of us can relate to, Morris sold Picasso's The Poet to Peggy Guggenheim to cover the costs. Once part of the personal family collection, this now hangs in the museum. Here are Frelingheisen's murals in the dining room, a totally different style and palette than her husband. She has inserted corrugated metal into these frescoes to create a sculptural element. And here we enter Morris's studio space. Yes, that's a checkerboard marble floor in a workspace. But what you also see on display here is a selection from the rich Cubist collection amassed by the couple, including works by Juan Gris and Georges Braque. And as you start to look more, you see a Calder, there's a Nam Gabo statue right on that pedestal in the front. Many of these artist sites contain collections of works by friends, colleagues, or artists admired from previous generations, as well as their own works. Now we'll travel up to northern New England. This is someone many of us actually feel we do know, Winslow Homer, in front of one of his marine works painted at his home and studio in Prouts Neck, Maine. The photo reinforces the image we have come to have of him as this grizzled recluse of a man holed up in rugged Maine, an image he helped to perpetuate. By the time he moves here full-time, he has already become a well-known illustrator of Harper's Weekly, a documentarian of the Civil War, and a genre painter of pastoral and rural life. He lives and works out of a converted carriage barn, which is part of a bigger complex of buildings owned by his family. Notice there are minimal amounts of windows on the facade of this building. And I want you to take a look at that balcony. This is the view from that balcony. His own brother used to say that Homer would wear out the floorboards from pacing on it. This was a view Homer came to know intimately. The cliff walk is just a short way from the studio. Either before or after a visit, one can see this painting, weather-beaten, on view at the Portland Museum of Art, which owns the site. This view makes you understand Homer, what moved him as a man, as well as the artist. You stand in the painting when you're there. It is transformative. It is an immersive experience you cannot replicate anywhere else. And it provides insight into inspiration and the mental processes of art making. Now, not all inspiration must come from such bombastic scenery. We traveled to Connecticut to the farm Julian Alden Weir bought when he was already an established painter in New York. Weir purchased the farm by parting with a European painting much coveted by the property owner and the additional sum of $10. Once there, he created a close-knit family home and convivial atmosphere for other artists, turning to his immediate environs for new artistic inspiration, as evidenced in this work, Autumn 1906, in the site's collection. It's like stepping into a Robert Frost poem. Everything is here. Stone walls, requisite red barns, and paths that wind through pasture and woodland. One of the numerous outbuildings is Weir's studio, a ceiling he painted blue, green, and accented with painted plaster stars. But here is the artist in his true studio, nature. Other artists painted these environs, including John Henry Twachtman, Albert Pinkham Ryder, and Childe Hassam, who all made extended visits to this property. Daughter Dorothy, an artist in her own right, married sculptor Mahan Rai Young, who is best known for This Is the Place monument in Salt Lake City, Utah, of which we see a series of models here. He built his own two-story studio on property, which you see here. He was befriended by artist couple Doris and Sperry Andrews, who later took up residence and helped to ensure the property's preservation. So there's 3 generations of artists who have lived here and worked here. Today, it's a National Parks Service site, sister site to St. Gaudens, and newly immortalized on a United States quarter. You should all go and get one. Connecticut boasts 2 other really important artist enclaves. One is the Bush Holly House, a boarding house in Cos Cob, which was the gathering place for the first American Impressionist colony in the nation. Here, Weir's friend John Twackman is teaching a student near the waterfront. Artists drew inspiration from the historic village and the nearby farms. And then there is the Old Lime Colony. More than 150 artists came to paint here. Many stayed in a boarding house run by unmarried, what I like to call entrepreneur, Florence Griswold. That's Child has some painting, The Apple Blossoms on plein air, a painting which appears at Wright, only rediscovered a few years ago, and now in the site's collection. Below is the view from fellow artist William Chadwick's studio, which gives you a glimpse of the bucolic landscape which butts up against the Lieutenant River. But this was as much about community as it was about painting. This, on the left, is the self-named Hot Air Club on the back porch of the boarding house. I think the name speaks for itself. And this is the view today from the entry hall towards that porch. I like to think, oh, what amazing things one would hear among that conversation and debate. Yet one still, I think, gets a sense of what it might have been like. But the site's showpiece is the formal dining room, for which it was an honor to be selected to paint a panel. There was even a committee who decided which colleagues were worthy. Like the frescoes at the Frelingheisen Morris property, these works of art were made for this space and can only be experienced here. They also illustrate artistic collaboration and competition among both friends and rivals. Those relationships are what one gets to learn about when visiting these sites. And here in the lower left is Miss Florence, as she was called, and what we can clearly see is still an intact, one-of-a-kind art environment installation. I'd like to now move beyond New England and focus on some sculptor sites. Many artists lived and worked in urban environments. This is the Greenwich Village home of Chaim Gross, arts educator and direct carver. He immigrated to New York at 20 to escape the increasing anti-Semitic wave. His is a self-proclaimed American dream story, the type of narrative these sites also have to offer, universal stories of perseverance, of triumph, of loss and failure. These help to break down the distance of the genius artists that we create. Here he is seated in the studio he helped design. And here is a modern view. You can see how intact it is to the slide before. Honestly, we could just drop Chaim right back in there. I've talked a lot about inspiration, but these sites are about the physicality of making. All the tools of the trade are here, the chisels, the sketches, the pencils. You can start to make connections between the process and the finished works. This happens time and again at these sites, because at the core, these places are about where art was made. You have, as scholar Wanda Korn and longtime champion of Haas, who wrote the book's foreword and apparently is attending tonight, she asserts you have returned to the scene of the crime, and you have in many ways. Once again, though, these sites allow us to venture beyond the studio space. This room shows but one example of the consistent curatorial impulses of these artists. Here, Gross's own work is arranged among his collection of African masks, which were highly influential to his work, and works by colleagues such as Red Grooms and Raphael Sawyer, as well as those of European masters such as Renoir, all set alongside the trappings of mundane everyday life, like the record player that you see in that console. This composing is an extension of what they do in the studio. Right now, I think we are keenly attuned to the decisions that we make in our own homes. Artists are fearless and give us permission to emulate them. As you have already seen, there is home decor inspiration within these pages and at these sites, illustrating, I believe, that the concept of the color that you paint your own bedroom actually says something about who you are and what moves you. So too for these artists. Here is another woodworking virtuoso, Norton Escherich. Escherich began as a painter and printmaker and then evolved into sculpture and furniture making. He initially actually started working in wood to create frames for his paintings. This staircase at right exemplifies his approach to design, highlighting the natural qualities of the wood, no desire to disguise original material, and frankly, just beautiful. This is painstakingly worked, but the way in which it hangs, it just seems effortless. Here is Escherich's own handmade house, which is really an artwork in itself, as many Haas sites are. The series of progressively built spaces that comprise this rural Pennsylvania home were built in succession. Escherich's own studio building was the first completed on the far right. The stacked stone remains intentionally rusticated, the artist purportedly removing the mason's mortar work for the look he preferred. For those of us that work at these sites, those types of aesthetics over construction, we're familiar with those. Almost a decade and a half later, he added the adjoining wooden tower, which included a dining room and a bedroom. And the last addition was actually built 26 years later still, a concrete silo coated in a fresco of brilliant hues of ochre, purple, brown, and green. The result is an organically conceived and interconnected sculptural form. One is hard pressed to find a straight line anywhere. And I just want to point out, as we talk about like what that progression was, I want you to think about that in the creation of this basically holistic work of art, he spent infinitely more time on the creation of this piece than on any other singular artwork in his career. And so that is the truth for any of those artists that create these kinds of architectural environs. Inside, it is all about surface and texture. He was known to labor about finding the exact right piece of wood, while Chaim Gross looked to the wood to suggest what form it sort of wished to become. This is the one place where you can see Escherich's sculpture and furniture exhibited together in the cohesive environment for which it was originally designed. So many of the objects here are handcrafted. He would not buy something if he could make it. Each of these ordinary utilitarian objects is a work of art, and together, sort of collectively, they create these mini small sculpture displays. Further south, this is Ann Norton, whose home and studio is in West Palm Beach, Florida, and is one of the newer sites in the network. Here she is hard at work on the piece 7 Figures, inspired by a cliff face in Utah. Inspiration can really, truly come from anywhere, and which is seen, as you see on right, on the site today. And of course, the various aspects of sculpture making are displayed in the studio she designed, such as the rough logs awaiting further carving. Norton worked in many mediums, but she also worked in wood and favored northwestern cedar. But the studio spaces also include the less glamorous elements of art making, notably things such as the slop sink that you see at left. Here are details that might be missed when visiting in person. The book pages allow us to linger. These are the complex patina potions and formulas that create surfaces on bronze sculpture. A bit of alchemy and magic that evokes the same childlike wonder we all had when first modeling clay and finger painting. And going into these studios, that's what that's the experience this also often creates. This is what awaits outside the studio, a multidisciplinary expression of art, architecture, and landscape, which happens at so many sites. These are monumental brickworks, late in career. hand-formed and home-fired, completely integrated into a landscape of Norton's design. As Norton faced terminal leukemia, she embarked on creating a lush tropical oasis in her suburban town, with the express goal to leave it for her community to enjoy in perpetuity. I love this story because it's so personal. It speaks to the basic human desires to create, to commune, to endure, but it's also a preservation story. All these sites were saved through effort, at times by the artist and at others by those with fierce commitment to ensuring legacy. This is an important aspect of these sites that we also sought to highlight in the book. Alvin Polachek, Czech-born figurative sculptor, first made a living executing ecclesiastical works in churches throughout the Midwest. He went on to have successful careers as a commissioned sculptor and as longtime head of the sculpture department at the Art Institute of Chicago. He retired to Winter Park, Florida to build his dream home and studio with the intent to keep sculpting even as he gave up active teaching. The concrete building that he designed includes Moravian and Slavic influences from his childhood, such as the colorful tiles you see there in the courtyard. Soon after moving to Florida, he suffered a stroke which paralyzed his entire left side. Wheelchair bound, he continued to sculpt with only his right hand. The lakeside landscape was designed to feature Polachek's work. This includes casts of earlier commissions as appear at the St. Gaudens site. Here is Lady of the Roman Campagna. This is the sower, the original located at the Chicago Botanic Garden. An idealized male figure is sowing the seeds of his future, a self-determination allegory which served as one of Polachek's personal credos. Elizabeth Ney, whose own motto was "Arise," had already lived an intriguing life before designing and opening her Austin, Texas studio. The first woman sculptor to attend the Munich Arts Academy, she counted King Ludwig II as her friend and patron and occupied a studio at the royal court. She and her husband emigrated to this country in part to escape political unrest. She gave up sculpting to run a cotton plantation and raise a family, and took up her art again in her 50s, executing commissions of notable Texans for the 1893 Columbian Exposition. She designed a studio inspired by the castles of her youth and helped to create an artistic enclave in Austin. She named the studio Formosa, Portuguese for beautiful, likely referencing time spent in Madeira. The contrasting prairie landscape illustrates her dedication to leaving it in its natural state. Here is a typical example of her romantic style. This is one of her best known works, Lady Macbeth. Despite a conventional sculptural mode, she was anything but. She was a fierce advocate for women's voting rights. She refused to take her husband's name, would often sleep in the open air when staying at her studio, wearing caftans and turbans and the like, and her fierce commitment to live on her own terms is embraced in the contemporary programming offered today at the site. Charles Marion Russell, known as the great storyteller of the American West. When I went to visit the region, I was immediately affectionately told, he is Westerners' Western painter. He designed his log cabin studio in the middle of his suburban neighborhood in Great Falls, Montana. It's built out of recycled telephone poles, and Russell liked to say he did his best work in log cabins. It likely reminded him of his youth spent in the Utica Basin wilderness. Russell himself was a lifelong outspoken advocate for Native American rights. Here's a detail of the myriad personal objects that often grace a studio space. You can see the props used in his paintings, as well as a photo of himself and his wife, Nancy, on left, second shelf, who served as his business manager his entire career. Many know Russell for his paintings, but he was also a published novelist and sculptor of small bronzes, like that at top right on the case, which I've pulled out a detail of a similar work on the bottom left. Before he built this studio space, his wife Nancy exhibited and sold these types of work out of the dining room showroom of their home. Not everyone decides to build their dream home or studio from scratch. some demonstrate their ingenious application of what we call in the preservation field adaptive reuse. Georgia O'Keeffe's home and studio in Abiquiu, New Mexico is perhaps one of the more famous. The infamous black door in the inner courtyard of her adobe home was the subject of more than 20 paintings. The desert landscape that inspired her has become synonymous with the artist and her work. She had to wait years until the Catholic Church would sell her this site, and then painstakingly made it her own through preservation of the traditional adobe, while also adding modern touches, such as the large picture windows, to take full advantage of the singular light and her sweeping views. Here is the interior of her sitting room looking out at cottonwood trees, and this is the back cover of the book. The aesthete-square quality is representative of her modern sensibilities and is punctuated with very few objects like this Bertoia bird chair, which almost serves as a sculpture in the room. O'Keeffe's own sculpture can be found in other rooms on site. They seem expected and familiar, but the book reveals that the most crowded room in the house is actually the kitchen and pantry. The artist was a foodie and grew her own staples and believed in sustainability. She made her own yogurt. Her gardens have actually recently been restored and also can be enjoyed by visitors. Here is adaptive reuse on a grand scale. Donald Judd turned an abandoned cast iron sewing factory in New York's Soho neighborhood into a place where he could experiment with his ideas about the permanent installation of art. Once complete, it was also a place of gathering to discuss ideas about art, an informal salon of sorts, like many Haas sites. Here is an example of how those ideas manifested, combining living and workspace with furniture of his own design and works by contemporaries. On the wall is a work by Frank Stella, originally owned by architect Philip Johnson, but traded for the Judd work that now graces the grounds at Johnson's Glass House in Connecticut, also open as a public site. Several years later, Judd expanded upon these ideas in Marfa, Texas. His projects at Marfa were executed with a clear vision towards legacy and were even larger in scope than those in New York. He was keenly aware of balancing his own architectural projects with respecting the traditional structures he was adapting for use, such as the wall you see here. He built it using traditional adobe brick building techniques. The most personal of all of his properties in Marfa is the block. Judd turned 2 airplane hangars in a former administrative building into exhibition and living spaces, also building new structures such as a bathhouse and designing a garden. Most artists occupy numerous studios throughout their careers, and successful artists often have simultaneous studios in the city and country. People like Daniel Chester French certainly did. Rarely, though, are multiple sites associated with a single artist preserved. The opportunity to study Judd's evolution through these 2 extant sites is unique and valuable. Conceptual artist David Ireland adapted his own space from a Victorian home in San Francisco's Mission District. The former home and sales room of an accordion salesman, you can even see the gilded letter signage in the window. Here, Ireland is creating a sculpture by tossing concrete between his hands until it becomes a perfect sphere. It gives us a sense of what is to come inside. This is the ultimate in DIY. He did a series of what he deemed maintenance actions, returning architecture to its original bones. You can actually see the exposed window casements at far right. This was part homeowner's restoration and part art performance. He recorded the cracks and history of the plaster walls through numerous coats of polyurethane, which today glow like amber. When you're there, you actually feel like you're in this small little lacquer jewel box. He used everyday objects and even refuse to transform them into works of art. Yes, that's a chandelier made out of propane torches. This site breaks conventional ideas of home and studio altogether. The whole thing is one large art installation. This is also a newer site, just saved within the last few years. I wanted to convey that these types of sites are not static. More are coming online all the time, and helping to guide these artists, descendants, or preservationists through that process is part of the work that we do. I want to conclude by touching upon the types of artists who are underrepresented or do not traditionally fit into the mainframe of art history: self-taught artists, folk artists, indigenous artists, and people of color. Clementine Hunter worked her whole life as a field laborer and later as domestic staff at a plantation in Louisiana. She did not even begin to create art until midlife, using discarded materials left by a visiting artist. It also just goes to show it's never too late to tap into your creativity. She painted on everything: cardboard, mugs, cigar boxes, and she thinned her paint to make it last longer. This is one of the buildings on the plantation, designed, built, and used by slaves in an earlier generation from Clem, as she was known, who was born emancipated. And here is what she created on that space's upper floor: a series of murals on plywood depicting her life on the plantation, including cotton picking, washing day, and here at left, going to church. I like to think of this effort as a little bit of a reappropriation of this space on her part. But this is, of course, in part because she was never able to build her own signature home and studio. We used to call this outsider art, but increasingly we refer to these people as having a completely insider perspective. Only she can tell this story through her art. Her narrative is inspiring, but it also reminds us of the work to be done in validating and identifying these contributions to our artistic legacy through preserved spaces. So I'm going to end where I started, right back at the glorious St. Gaudens site. I hope this lecture will start you on your own journey, and that the book offers rich virtual travel until such time as people venture out again. Many sites remain closed for the immediate future or have limited hours or special restrictions around touring. But many also have opened up their landscapes for respite and renewal, such as the St. Gaudens site. Please consult with individual sites to see about opportunities for visitation. In the meantime, I hope you will take the opportunity to take a virtual journey through our publication. I like to think that it is easy for those who have, this will be their first introduction to the art history of this country, and that even for seasoned devotees of particular artists, that there are wonderful tidbits that we have highlighted where you are able to rediscover. The book is available on the
Hi, Valerie, thank you. I think we're working through some audio issues now before we get to the questions.
At what point did people, can you hear me there?
Just at the end when you were talking about the book. So if you might repeat the last couple of sentences so people can hear you, and then we'll get to some question and answers.
Sure. So, you know, I urge people to honestly look to see what individual sites are offering, because it's constantly fluid. And in the meantime, the book can be your foray into these magical sites. I was saying that I like to think that for those, we've made a book that is incredibly accessible for people who have actually had, this will be their first entree into the history of art in this country. But I also like to think that we've been able to include some tidbits that allow for even the most seasoned devotee of any individual artist to sort of discover something new and magical about them. And the book is available through all major retailers and also through the publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, and exclusive signed copies are through chesterwood.org as the administrative home of Haas. So thank you.
Valerie, brava, thank you so much. Of course, I've been to St. Gaudens and Chesterwood many, many times, and I definitely always see new things and experience those sites meaningfully. And my mind is abuzz right now with all the trips I'm going to take when we're able to travel again. I'm Thayer Tolles. I'm president of the St. Gaudens Memorial, and I encourage all of you who would like to ask Valerie questions, if you're on Zoom, through the question and answer function, and then also through Facebook. While you're doing that, I'd like to just extend my thanks to the St. Gaudens Memorial and National Historical Park staff for helping us with this presentation tonight. Of course, as Valerie said, it does take a village. Well, you know, the history of the St. Gaudens Memorial and the park is actually rather complicated. The memorial was founded in 1919 by, among other people, Daniel Chester French, and the property was turned over to the federal government in 1964 and became a National Park Service site the following year. I was thinking as you were speaking, even though you were presenting all these sites and artists sort of one by one, that none of these artists existed in a vacuum. And it reminded me that when I've been doing research on St. Gaudens, the St. Gaudens Memorial, how present Daniel Chester French and ultimately his daughter Peggy French Cresson were in the management of the memorial. And I thought maybe you could speak a little bit about that relationship and maybe some others between the park sites.
Right. Sure. So I think, you know, what's wonderful about that connection between St. Gaudens, the St. Gaudens Memorial, and Chesterwood is it speaks to this question of legacy. And the memorial is an early example, actually, of one of these sites, you know, deliberately and thoughtfully preserved. And so, as you said, Daniel Chester French was a founder, but also a longtime trustee, I think, up until basically right up until his death. And Margaret French Cresson was a sculptor in her own right, who then also became a trustee for several decades, basically up until her death. And what Thayer and I were talking about is that as Margaret French Cresson had to really think about these ideas and issues around legacy and around the preservation of a site as a public site, she turned to sort of the precedent and organizational tools that she had been exposed to through her involvement at the St. Gaudens Memorial. And I think what's really interesting is looking for those models is what descendants, as a person who's on the phone with them consistently, are also looking for today. You know, so there's sort of what happens historically, but that history then continues into the history of what it took and what efforts were made to preserve and how those happened. So many of these artists intersect, and I think this is the first presentation I may have given in a very long time that does not include Alana, but it's a great example. But I was really trying to stick with some sculptors to show what kind of range we have within the network. And you know, what's really amazing is that you are able to see in the Hudson Valley basically two chapters of a story. You are able to go to the Thomas Cole Historic Site in Catskill, the progenitor of the Hudson River School, and then see the place where the artistic birthplace of his student, and then preeminent Hudson River School painter, Frederick Church, occurred. And you're able to do this honestly in the same day. I think that there are other linkages that are often interesting and unknown, or not unknown, but you're not aware that you're able to go and experience these sites and know that whatever I'm going to talk about actually was happening in a place that you can still go see. For example, some are not aware, probably many people in this audience are aware, but some people are not aware that Jackson Pollock was a student of Thomas Hart Benton. And while many people have been to the Pollock studio, many people are not even aware that one can go to the studio in Kansas City, and that Pollock actually went and visited there himself. You have other artists who were friends. I think of Charles Demuth, whose childhood home is preserved in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who, because of diabetes, often his world became very small, but his artistic circle was vast and included people like Georgia O'Keeffe, who visited him in Lancaster. So I think that these are the threads are things that we're continuing, I think, always to find out more about. And I think they are established in these sort of enclaves that I talked about, but really every artistic home is a potential enclave, whether formalized or informalized. And I think that that's really sort of the wonderful thing, that you also, when you visit these sites, you learn about those connections, you hear about those connections, because those narratives are given to you while you are there.
Right, they're all part of communities. We have a couple of great questions in the Zoom feed, and from Melissa Trafton, who says, "Fabulous talk, Valerie."
Oh, thank you.
Great question. In most cases, there seems to be a continuity in the materials used or the aesthetic between the artist's work and the studio home. Are there any in which you see completely surprising or different responses? You're going through your mental Rolodex.
I am. I'm sitting here going. One doesn't. I would actually. I don't know. I know Wanda's here. She may think of one. I can't think of one immediately. I think because for me, that's really the point, that you go and you see that synergy. And then you see that synergy actually expand out into other large scale media, where the landscape itself becomes a sort of expression of those values, where those things that you think about the process and the work and the way in which someone approaches their work. And again, I'll use Alana as an example, is all of the things that I love about church come together at Alana in ways that are new. The scale of it, the color of it, the depth of field of it, all of those things. And so to me, often these homes and studios, beyond the studio proper, the whole thing is a laboratory studio. And there aren't, for me, I can't think of one, but I will, I'm sure, as soon as I get off, and then maybe I can email that to you. I have to think about it a little more.
A question from Lisa Stone, who also says, "Fabulous presentation." And great question, and you have to keep this short. Can you describe how Haas has connections with European or international artists' homes and studios? And I know there's great ongoing work on that.
I can. We were really fortunate in 2018 to receive a grant from the Terra Foundation that allowed for us to have our first international exchange of colleagues' presentations, several days in the Berkshires and then several days in the UK. There is an analogous organization in Europe called the Artist Studio Museum Network. And we continue to work on ways to collaborate more. In fact, I have a call on Friday with one of the speakers and curators at Doric House in the UK. So we want to do more of it. And I actually would like us to move a little bit beyond Europe, frankly, and start to make tentacles out into the rest of the Americas and to Asia, because these places exist everywhere.
That's great, especially as we begin to think more broadly about what is American.
Yes, exactly.
And in museums and these sites as well. Before I turn it over to Rick for a couple of Facebook questions, Helen Nicholson had a sort of a coda to your last question.
All the gangs here this evening.
So she says that the Pollock Krasner house is unexpectedly cozy. It's filled with antique eclectic furniture where people might expect high modernism.
That's a great example. That is a great example. Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna see what Rick has been encountering in the Facebook feed, and then I will close it out.
Well, Thayer, the Facebook feed has been pretty quiet. So I am showing no questions on the Facebook feed. So well,
I have a couple more. Valerie, Beth Coleman has asked about the Maxfield Parish Oak site, and perhaps you could speak more broadly to the process of how sites join the Haas network and are evaluated.
Yes, so we have some fundamental requirements, one of which is that it needs to be a site that is regularly open to the public. And that doesn't mean it can't be in private hands, but it needs to have an education and interpretation component around artist legacy and, in fact, process. There is a pretty rigorous application process. This year, we are very focused on women artist sites, and in coming years, we're going to try to really get a handle on some of this diversification of the network that I spoke about in my last couple slides. But over time, we find out about sites all the time, and there has been in the past and will be in the future at some point an open call where people can basically apply. But this is a pretty rigorous process, and I would actually ask if anybody knows of a site or is interested in learning more about it, they should contact me directly. I take calls and emails from people who know sites or are in charge of sites or are trying to preserve sites all the time.
That's great. This is a very interesting question from Professor Michael Swope. Do these studios consistently reflect the respective artists in a mature stage of life and work rather than younger and formative years?
Yes. And I think some of the reason for that is because it is at that moment that the artist is able to afford to perhaps create the kind of signature home and studio that, at least historically, that has been of interest for preservation. I think a noted exception is the childhood home of Edward Hopper, which is part of the Haas site network. And, to go there is to basically see the light that we see in every single Hopper painting and understand that took hold of him as, a boy of under 10 years old. I think that is, and that question speaks to the bigger issue of how representative then we really are of really the real depth and breadth of art in this country, because often not only are mature places saved, but also more humble homes like that of James Castle, who's a deaf and self-taught artist in Boise, Idaho. He lived in a typical suburban home. This site in the past would have likely never been saved. And this site has been saved in the last couple of years by the city of Boise. So we have more, that is a correct and apt observation. And they're touchstones, I also think, frankly, for often there's one site that can represent an entire movement.
That's terrific. Valerie, could you say a couple of words about the exhibition that's been circulating of photographs of the artists in their spaces? And I'll put a little bit a pitch in that it's planned to come to the St. Gaudens National Historical Park next summer.
Yes, a number of years ago now, through a grant from the Wyatt Foundation, Haas was able to create a photographic exhibition of digitally copied photographs of all these artists in their studios. And that exhibition travels around to Haas sites, although it doesn't need to exclusively be at Haas sites. And it creates, I think, a little window into the world of both the studio, but also gives you a measure of the people that you're talking about. And many of my slides tonight, where I opened with a photograph of an image of the artist, are the images from that photographic exhibition. It is currently up at the Sam and Alfreda Maloof site in Alta Loma. Another version of that is going to open in January at the Norton Sculpture Gardens in West Palm Beach, and fingers crossed it will open in June at St. Gaudens.
Indeed. Valerie, thank you so much. This has just been so informative and entertaining, and I just, I want to bust out of quarantine and 44 different places at once. But I did want to let everyone know, especially those of you who are in the Upper Valley, that the St. Gaudens National Historical Park is open through October 31st. The grounds have been open all season, and fortunately, recently the little studio and the atrium space have been open. So I hope that you will be able to come and experience the extraordinary beauty and creativity of that place. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and be well.
You
Good
will.
night.
And thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.